You think you know Madagascar, rainforests, lemurs, a wild isolated island sitting off the southeastern coast of Africa, close enough to the continent that you'd assume it's basically an African story with a few exotic animals thrown in. And that's exactly what most people assume. It seems obvious. The island is right there, barely 400 miles from Mozambique, practically close enough to see on a clear day. Of course the people came from Africa. Of course the culture, the language, the genetic fingerprint of the population reflects the continent it sits next to. That's just geography doing what geography does. Except here's the thing, it doesn't. Not even close. And when you actually start pulling at this thread, when you look at the language, the archaeology, and especially the DNA, the picture that emerges is so much stranger, so much older, and so much more jaw-dropping than the schoolbook version that you're going to spend the next few minutes legitimately rethinking what the word isolated even means. Because the story of Madagascar isn't a story about an island that got left behind. It's a story about an island that became the final destination of one of the most audacious ocean crossings in all of human prehistory. A voyage that happened without maps, without compasses, without any of the navigation technology we assume you'd need to cross an open ocean. And by the end of this, the island looks completely different. And so does your idea of what ancient human capability actually looked at. Let's go back before the myth starts. Start with the geography, because the geography here is doing something unusual. Madagascar sits in the western Indian Ocean, and at first glance, it reads as peripheral, a big island on the edge of the map, positioned away from the great centers of ancient civilization. But look at it from a different angle. Look at it the way a sailor would look at it, following wind and current rather than political borders. Suddenly, Madagascar is not on the edge of anything. It's at the convergence point of three massive maritime corridors. To the west, the East African coast and the Swahili trade network. To the north, the Arabian Sea and the monsoon routes that connected the Arab world to South and Southeast Asia for thousands of years. To the east, and this is the part that changes everything, the open Indian Ocean, swept by consistent westward currents and seasonal winds that, if you knew how to use them, could carry a boat from the Indonesian archipelago all the way to the African coastline. A place like this doesn't produce passivity. A place like this, sitting at the intersection of three ancient maritime highways, produces contact, movement, layering. It produces a society built from more inputs than any simple story can hold. Keep that in mind, because it matters later. Now, most people who've heard anything about Madagascar's history will tell you it's an African island settled by African people. And they're not wrong. They're just incomplete. The Bantu-speaking peoples of the African mainland did come here. Their influence is real and it's deep. You can hear it in certain words, see it in cattle culture, in some agricultural practices, in the genetic record. The Swahili coast connection is genuine, but here's what they usually skip. The Bantu didn't arrive first. When Bantu-speaking Africans began crossing the Mozambique Channel, there were already people on Madagascar, and those people had not come from Africa at all. That's the part that stops you cold. So, who was already there? And where on earth did they come from? This is where the origin story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer is Borneo. Not symbolic, not approximate, Borneo, specifically. The island in the heart of the Indonesian archipelago, more than 5,000 miles away across open ocean. Researchers analyzing the Malagasy language found something that shouldn't statistically be possible by coincidence. The core vocabulary, the fundamental daily words, the structural grammar of Malagasy. The language spoken across Madagascar today traces most directly not to any African language family, but to the Austronesian language family of Southeast Asia, and more precisely still, to the Manyan language spoken by a group in the interior of Borneo. We're not talking about borrowed words from trade contact. We're talking about the foundational architecture of an entire language. The words for body parts, basic actions, numbers, the kind of vocabulary that only transfers when a community physically relocates and raises children in that tongue. That's a linguistic fingerprint you cannot fake and cannot explain away. The origin story doesn't start where you think. But now the question opens up even further. And it's a question that genuine scholars have wrestled with for decades. How do you sail 5,000 miles of open ocean without modern navigation? The Indian Ocean in ancient times was not an empty, unknowable void to the people who lived along its shores. The Austronesian peoples of maritime Southeast Asia were already the most accomplished open water sailors on Earth, long before any European maritime tradition matured. They had outrigger canoe technology that allowed stable deep ocean crossings. They read stars, currents, swells, bird patterns, and wind shifts with a precision that modern sailors with GPS sometimes struggle to match using traditional methods alone. The monsoon wind system of the Indian Ocean doesn't just blow randomly. It reverses predictably with the seasons, meaning a sailor who understood the rhythm could ride one monsoon out and another monsoon back. And the currents themselves flow westward across the southern Indian Ocean in exactly the direction that would carry a boat from Indonesia toward the African coast. This wasn't reckless luck. This was accumulated knowledge applied to a world-scale problem. Now watch what happens when you zoom in on the archaeology of Madagascar's earliest settlements. The material culture, the tools, the food production systems, the boat-building traditions, shows clear Southeast Asian signatures at the foundational layer. Rice cultivation, which is a Southeast Asian staple, appears in Madagascar's agricultural history in a way it simply doesn't across the African mainland at the same period. Outrigger canoe designs, still in use in Madagascar today, are architecturally identical to those found across Indonesia and the Pacific. Even certain musical structures and instrument designs echo the Austronesian world rather than the African one. The sailors didn't just land on an empty beach and then vanish. They built the cultural skeleton of an entire civilization, and that skeleton held even as new layers came in on top of it. The forgotten migration built a nation. Now here's what's easy to misread in this story. Two groups arriving on the same island in deep history sounds like a collision waiting to happen, a war of origins, a conflict between worlds. But Madagascar's genetic and cultural record tells a more complicated and ultimately more interesting story than simple conquest. The fusion that happened here was, in important ways, controlled. The Malagasy language that survived, and that the vast majority of people on the island speak today as their mother tongue, is Austronesian, not African, not a Creole, not a blend that split the difference. The linguistic core held. The Bantu arrivals folded into an Austronesian-speaking world, contributing enormously to the genetic pool, to agricultural practices, to the cattle herding culture that shapes Malagasy identity to this day, but without displacing the foundational language. And that tells you something profound about the nature of this particular merger. The Austronesian settlers were established enough, numerous enough, rooted enough in their institutions, that when the African arrivals came, whether gradually, through trade, or in more sustained waves, the resulting society absorbed the new without erasing the old. They took what helped them. They kept what defined them. That duality, adaptation and resistance existing simultaneously, is the actual engine of Malagasy civilization, and it's a pattern that keeps appearing every time you look closely. But here's what nobody tells you about Madagascar's place in the ancient world. The island was not some remote backwater quietly developing in isolation. By the early centuries of the first Millennium Common Era, and almost certainly before, Madagascar was a node in one of the most sophisticated long-distance trade networks humans had ever constructed, the Indian Ocean system that connected East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, and Southeast Asia into a single economic web. Arab traders came. Their influence shows up in the writing system that early Malagasy scholars used, a script derived from Arabic, and in certain loanwords in the language, and in the cosmological frameworks of some highland kingdoms. Indian Ocean merchants from the subcontinent passed through. And here's the archaeological detail that really lands it. Chinese trade ceramics have been found at sites on the island. Medieval Islamic manuscripts reference Madagascar ports as waypoints. This was a known location in the medieval world's mental map, a place merchants factored into calculations, a place that moved goods. And that global connectivity left marks, not just in the material record, but in the people themselves. Because every wave of contact brought people, and people brought genetics. And genetics don't lie about who was actually moving through a place. Which brings us to the part of this story that functions like a detective's closing argument. Because the DNA is where every thread we've been tracking converges into something undeniable. Genetic analyses of the Malagasy population have found a pattern that is, when you think about it, almost too precise to believe. The population carries ancestry from two primary sources in roughly comparable proportions. One cluster tracing to the African continent, specifically to Bantu-speaking East African populations, and another tracing to maritime Southeast Asia. That alone is remarkable, but the DNA gets more specific than that. The Southeast Asian lineage doesn't point vaguely at Asia, or even at the broader Indonesian archipelago as a whole. Research suggests the pattern points specifically toward Borneo and the Sulawesi region, matching exactly what the linguistic analysis of the Manyan connection had already implied. Two completely independent lines of evidence, one built from words, one built from biology, point to the same specific island in the same specific part of the world. The DNA doesn't match the myth. And it gets even more interesting when you look at what geneticists call the sex-specific patterns, the lineages inherited differently through mothers and fathers. Genetic analyses have found that the Southeast Asian and African contributions are not distributed equally across both sides of the inheritance tree. That kind of asymmetry doesn't appear randomly. It suggests that the migration wasn't simply random families drifting in together. There was structure to it, potentially specific roles, specific demographics, specific waves that skewed in particular directions. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that the founding Austronesian group had a particular demographic composition, perhaps more male-skewed, and that African women contributed substantially to the founding of subsequent generations. Others push back on the simplest versions of this interpretation. But here's what nobody disputes. The pattern is real, and a random accident does not produce a structured pattern like that across an entire island population. Then there's the bottleneck signal. Genetic diversity in Madagascar is lower than you'd expect for a population of its size and geographic range. That is a classic genetic signature of what's called a population bottleneck, a founding event where a small group of people arrived, established themselves, and then grew into a much larger population. The variation present today largely descends from that initial founding group, which tells you the Austronesian arrival wasn't a massive armada of thousands. It was probably a small fleet, maybe shockingly small. A tight group of people who crossed 5,000 miles of open ocean and, against all odds, made it, survived, and multiplied into a civilization. And that small founding group left such a deep genetic imprint that you can still see its shape in the DNA of Malagasy people today, more than 1,000 years later. One more genetic thread worth pulling. The African lineages in the Malagasy population aren't generic sub-Saharan markers. Research indicates they show Bantu-specific patterns consistent with East African coastal populations, which confirms that the African arrivals came primarily from the Mozambique Channel coast, and the Swahili corridor, not from the deep interior of the continent. That detail matters because it aligns with the historical picture of who was actually maritime capable and trade connected in that region at the relevant time periods. The Swahili coast was a seafaring, trading, cosmopolitan zone. It makes sense that the people who crossed to Madagascar came from exactly that world. Every piece of evidence, linguistic, archaeological, cultural, and genetic, is pointing in the same direction. This isn't a case where you have to pick between competing stories and declare one the winner. The different lines of inquiry are reinforcing each other, building a picture that is more coherent the more precisely you look at it. And that coherence is exactly what makes the Malagasy case so important, not just as a local history curiosity, but as a window into what ancient human beings were actually capable of. Now consider where we started. Madagascar. Remote, isolated, a biological curiosity sitting at the edge of Africa. Its giant lemurs and baobabs suggesting a world that evolution left behind, a world apart. That framing feels almost embarrassing now. This island was a destination that someone planned. It was found by sailors navigating the Indian Ocean without instruments, people who understood the ocean's logic well enough to cross 5,000 miles of it and arrive on a landmass that most of the world didn't know existed. It was then settled in layers: the Austronesian foundation, the Bantu integration, the Arab influence, the Indian Ocean trade contact, each layer adding something, none of them fully overriding what came before. And it was connected, throughout the medieval period and beyond, to the most important long-distance trade network on the planet. The result is a population whose genetic profile reads like a compressed map of the ancient Indian Ocean world, carrying inside their own biology the evidence of two continents and multiple civilizations meeting, negotiating, and fusing over centuries. Borneo sailors, plus Bantu farmers, plus Arab traders, plus Indian Ocean winds, all colliding on one island. That's not isolation. That's a crossroads. That's the world's most unlikely melting pot, sitting quietly in an ocean that most school curricula barely mention. So here's the final thought. We love simple origin stories because simple feels safe, feels clean, feels like it settles something. Madagascar is African. The Malagasy are an African people. Done. Except the story has never been that clean, and the evidence has been saying so for a long time. In the words of the language, in the shape of the boats, in the flavor of the rice, in the grain of the DNA. Every origin story, when you actually chase it down, turns out to be messier, older, and more impressive than the version you were sold. Madagascar is just one of the clearest cases where the evidence refuses to let you look away. So let me ask you this. Which part of this rewrote your assumptions the hardest? Was it the language connection to Borneo? The fact that it's visible in the DNA of people living on the island today? Or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know where the story hit. And if you think Madagascar's genetic mystery is strange, just wait. Next time, we're looking at another island, another impossible migration, another identity hiding in plain sight, and the conventional story is even further off than this one.